they're very busy people with lots of people making demands on their time. So it's very generous of Paul to come and speak to us tonight. I heard him speak about a month ago at the CEDA conference, where I think everybody in the room was impressed by the clarity with which he expressed himself and the lack of obfuscation in his answers. And so it was great when he accepted the invitation to speak. I'm just going to summarize Paul's life story from what's on his website now, by means of an introduction, and hopefully that means there'll be nothing that he disputes here. So Paul is a Glasgow lad, born in Springburn, and grew up in Glasgow and studied economic history and political science at Glasgow University. Served in the armed forces and latterly designing warships on the Clyde, through the shipyards there, and then spent a number of years at the Scottish Enterprise as a senior executive, working with the leadership of companies in that sector across Scotland, and became a council member of the Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders in Scotland, and also a member of the United GMB trade unions, and the PCS, the Scottish Enterprise, before becoming the Labour MP for Glasgow North East, and then latterly was the Shadow Under Secretary of State for Scotland for a while. And in November 2018, Paul won the Best Scot at Westminster award at the Scottish Politicians of the Year. And since then, he's played, I guess, an ongoing role in public campaigns in Glasgow to do with community-based initiatives and issues about, I guess, grassroots democracy and social cohesion and capacity, and as well as having an interest in heritage, built environment more generally. So it gives them a very broad base of experience, both in the realities of the issues that we're all grappling with, but also, you know, the landscape of politics and power in Scotland with which we try and deliver change. So unless that's been shockingly inaccurate, Paul, I will welcome you to our community and invite you to, I guess, present your experience for a while before we have a discussion. Over to you, Paul.
Very kind introduction, Tom. Makes it sound more impressive than it probably is. A lot of that's just been in the right place at the right time. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me along this evening. And really, it's been a real education in the period I've been in elected politics since 2017 to have the opportunity to serve Glasgow, a city I've got a keen interest in, and I've always had a keen interest in its heritage and its community spirit, and a lot of the challenges that it's had to endure over the years. There's a really good book by Michael Keatings about the history of housing in Glasgow, and the title of the book is "The City That Refused to Die." So in many ways, that's the truth of Glasgow. It's been subject to the most incredible social engineering over the last century, peaking at one of Europe's biggest cities, but then suffering one of the most severe declines in population of any European city, and the consequential social and economic challenges that continues to present to Glasgow today, where it is still the most unequal part of Scotland and has some of the worst health and social outcomes of any community in Scotland. So a lot of challenges, and that is largely rooted in the lack of economic agency, the lack of control over capital, and, you know, housing being a fundamental part of that equation. There are many things to sort of take as positives in a city like Glasgow, despite all of that narrative. It, up until 2003, had the second biggest stock of social housing in the world, after Hong Kong, and today, you know, still has a large amount of social housing even though that's no longer council housing. It's now been transferred to housing associations, primarily Wheatley Group, formerly known as Glasgow Housing Association. But there is also a really strong community housing association movement in Glasgow, which grew up really in the face of the mass demolitions of tenements in the city. During the 1960s and 70s, the first housing associations were established in Glasgow in the 1970s in communities like Govan, Denniston, Springburn, and communities fighting to stop their populations being cast to the four winds, having saw what's happened in a community like the Gorbals. They wanted to stop the same thing happening. And that first generation of community activism really set the scene for what is today more than half, or almost half, sorry, of Scotland's community housing associations being located in Glasgow. Over 80 of these housing associations still exist in the city. So a strong bedrock of community control and democratic accountability. And that's really, you know, a critical foundation for what we talk about fashionably today is community wealth building. Control of housing is critical to this idea, but it's not a new idea by any stretch. It's something that's been around for around half a century anyway. Moving beyond the idea of municipal housing, which grew up about a century ago after the first municipal housing acts were passed in Parliament. The idea that landlordism should be challenged, the legacy of feudalism should be finally taken on, as universal suffrage became a reality. But we've still a long way to go to achieve true justice of land ownership and property ownership in this country. And there's a lot of discussion about how we should move forward in Scotland. And I think that co-housing is a really innovative idea that we should be engaged in making more mainstream in our thinking. And as was alluded to by David in his opening remarks, it's something that when you mention to officials and people in government, they kind of look at you like you've got two heads. You know, there really is an ignorance about what it means. There is only really two typologies that are discussed: volume house building or private property development. And that can take the form of, as I mentioned, you know, suburban sprawl or increasingly build to rent investment vehicles, which we're seeing springing up in cities like Glasgow, which are largely owned overseas by institutional investors looking for stable, high returns, and effectively sucking rents out of the national economy, never mind the city economy. I don't think that's a sustainable model for building wealth. I don't think it's a sustainable model for capital investment. And I think it's highly destructive. So there's the other model, which is social housing, which again takes the form of large groupings such as Wheatley Sanctuary, places for people, etc., or the community housing model, which is you know, typified by the community housing association movement, cooperatives, and of course direct municipal ownership of council housing, which doesn't exist in Glasgow anymore, but does in other cities such as Dundee in Scotland. So beyond those concepts of what housing is in Scotland, you're struggling. And that's really where I think co-housing is really interesting. And I think fundamentally the idea of more community-led housing in Scotland, the more community ownership of housing and property in Scotland is a good thing. And it's something I'm keen to, in principle, champion and advocate for. Because fundamentally it's about control of capital, it's about control of decision-making and wealth direction in communities. Increasingly, I find myself palliating communities that are largely bereft of any real economic agency and are simply subject to the prevailing winds of economic forces beyond their control. And it can be very demoralizing and alienating for people. And I think it goes to the heart of a large part of why we have a mental health crisis in this country, a cost of living crisis in this country. The collapse of agency and control over people's lives is a real one, and it manifests itself in these kind of destructive ways. I think, having mentioned the strengths of a community in Glasgow, the idea of building up community housing associations, it forms a basis for a wider capacity building exercise. And the challenge I would put back to this group is, how do you find a way to build your power as an organisation with a voice in Scotland and shaping the future direction of public policy? I would say it lies in places like joining and engaging with housing associations, particularly community housing associations, and using that as a vehicle to build up the idea of co-housing as a product within social housing. And I think that would be a really important way to influence. Increasingly, we're seeing community housing associations under threat. We're seeing a tacit policy of destroying community housing associations from the Scottish Housing Regulator. We're seeing the idea of corporatizing, professionalizing in their vision of the world. Housing is the way forward, and the idea that communities should have a say and a role on boards directing things is to be resisted and to be shut down. That what we want is focus groups of customers and residents, not communities in control of their own housing. That's really the direction of travel in which Scotland is currently moving, and I believe it's a scandal. And it cuts across the very idea of community wealth building, because largely we've allowed corporate capture of these institutions like the Scottish Housing Regulator, and they're pushing a very clear pro-capitalist agenda. So there's a bigger fight to be had there, but there's also a need to build power within weakened institutions like community housing associations. As the first generation move on, there isn't a new generation coming to the fore to reinvigorate these organisations, and they're very vulnerable to being captured and destroyed. So I would encourage anyone who has a sense of activism, a sense of civic duty, a sense of the idea of communities being empowered, to engage where things exist, where institutional capacity exists, and to reinforce that, and to bring these new ideas like co-housing to the fore. It shouldn't just be about housing assistance grants to develop social housing to be rented out at social rents. It should be a bigger idea of a mixture of housing. The concept of social housing is envisaged by people like John Wheatley was that it was a social leveller, that it wasn't an idea that poor people live in social housing and rich people own houses. It was the idea that the doctor and the hospital porter could live in the same street in similar houses and form a joint community, with equality at the heart of it. I think that's the ultimate vision of a stable, well-adjusted society, where we have that unity of purpose and we don't have the kind of economic segregation, class segregation that we have in the economic geography of our country today. That would be the idea of how you move forward with a product like co-housing. Particularly for young people as well, we're seeing increasing displacement of young people, my generation certainly, from property ownership. The idea of home ownership is a distant one for many on average incomes. We're seeing the government increasingly, particularly at UK level, moving towards entrenching those inequalities. So we had speculation, for example, recently about cutting inheritance tax. That's the equivalent of owning 4 average-sized family homes. I think the threshold's £1 million. That's more than someone on living on minimum wage will earn in a lifetime, yet we tax that at quite a high rate. So I think that shows you the agenda of the current government, certainly at UK level, as to where they are going with that and how they prioritise the entrenchment of capital wealth over waged income. Very worrying trajectory, and particularly as we see people getting ever poorer and living standards declining. So we need to find ways in which we can build wealth in other ways. The idea that you can survive simply on waged income is increasingly difficult. And we see that because the vast majority of people currently on social security are actually in work. How do we reverse this cycle of economic inequality? I think a large part of that comes in building control over capital by communities in a cooperative spirit. I think that's really the core of how we move forward. The ethos of social and community housing appears to be being increasingly forgotten about, and this vacuum is really threatening its future. I'm currently engaged in fighting a takeover of Reid Vale Housing Association in the East End of Glasgow in Denniston. It was set up in 1975 by a group of local residents that were known as the Bathgate Street Mafia, led by local community activist John Bertolli, which stopped the demolition of the beautiful Victorian sandstone tenements in Denniston for a kind of modernist high-rise housing estate, and instead kept the community together and renovated those tenements, put indoor toilets and plumbing in, And indeed, even people who had bought their flats sold them back to the housing association with the idea that they would cooperatively co-own the institution of the housing association. That was a real community spirit, a tight unit of around 900 properties. And even to this day, it has the lowest social rents in Scotland. Yet it's now under threat of takeover by a massive Places for People group based in London with over 250,000 properties across the UK, 100 leisure centres. And to get tenants on side with the proposed takeover, Places for People have offered the tenants sitting currently in the housing association a 5-year rent freeze. But while this might sound appealing, it's very much part of a cynical PR operation, because Places for People's average rents are actually 26% higher than the Scottish average overall for social housing. A good example of this is Reedvale charging £69 a week for a 3-bedroom flat, while Places for People charge £98 a week. And indeed, when you look at the metrics, even within the Scottish Housing Regulator's own records, the performance of Places for People is woeful when compared with Reedvale, with emergency repairs taking 17 times longer. So I think that shows you the benefits of having closer community control and agency, more responsive, more reactive, and cares and loves the community they live within, rather than it being a remote exercise in managing capital at a distance. And I hope that even at this late stage, while the ballot's underway, that the residents will reject it. But we're also looking at other ways of challenging this, because we know that the consultants and the co-optees that have been foisted on the housing association in a kind of cynical programme of entryism by the regulator have cut corners in their arrogance to destroy this housing association. And I'm hopeful that through a judicial review, we might be also able to fight them off and use this as a line in the sand to protect community housing in Scotland, and reassert the rights of communities to own their own housing. And I think that building a relationship with the co-housing movement in Scotland is going to be critical to that. So I would encourage you to get involved with the likes of the Glasgow and West of Scotland Housing Association Forum, for example, and talking more about the idea of co-ownership in co-housing is a model for the evolution of social housing in Scotland. And that might well be something that housing associations are increasingly interested in, particularly as access to capital becomes increasingly challenging in the traditional model. I've done my best using my platform to shine a light on the threat to social housing in Scotland and community ownership of housing and democratic ownership of housing. I've raised it in the Glasgow Times. I've pressed the Scottish Housing Regulator. I will be going, to the Housing Committee in the Scottish Parliament next month to ask some challenging questions of the Scottish Housing Regulator and their agenda. And I'm hoping that there will be a long overdue inquiry into this increasingly sinister practice at the heart of what's going on. The Scottish Housing Regulator isn't accountable to government ministers, they're accountable to the Scottish Parliament. And I think it's time that our Parliament in Edinburgh took this seriously and what is going on. And I'm hopeful that we can make some progress in that regard. I'll certainly always use my platform in Parliament to stand up for community housing initiatives. But we need to work in cooperation with each other. It's not just about people in Parliament making, pontificating and issuing edicts about what should happen. We need to build capacity within communities. So all those of like mind who want to, build the idea of democratic ownership, the idea of cooperative ownership, the idea of co-housing, need to come to the fore and add their weight to the existing institutions that are out there. I'd also say a way to amplify the idea of co-housing is to work, for example, with tenants' unions, such as Living Rent, but also to table a petition to the Citizens Participation and Public Petitions Committee in the Parliament about the need to change legislation to better facilitate the development of co-housing and to promote co-housing, particularly within the social sector. I would also suggest that it might be worth considering potential amendments to the Housing Act that I believe is planned by the government for next year, and how we can, entrench co-housing at the heart of that and to better programme government in a legislative way to recognise its utility to the wider community as part of the housing mix in Scotland. And I'd also suggest that you look at where local government institutions are revising their local development plans. So I know, for example, that Glasgow is updating its development plan in the next year or so, the city development plan. And it would be good to highlight co-housing opportunities at the heart of that. I know there was a suggestion for a co-housing development opportunity in Maryhill, but it's been fledgling at best, I think it's fair to say, and very challenging to establish. I think it's also about engaging with financial institutions about how to finance co-housing and create the right products to finance co-housing as well, and how we can do that perhaps in cooperation with housing associations. And I think, you know, innovative campaign materials such as a manifesto for community housing would certainly be very helpful in that regard. There's very few housing cooperatives in Scotland, true cooperatives in Scotland. I think there's only one or two that I know of. Hawthorne Housing Cooperative in the north of Glasgow, and West Whitleyburn Cooperative in Cambuslang. But I think developing more of those kind of concepts would be really beneficial. So hopefully that's a useful overview of my perspective on things. It's a genuine desire to build the institutional capacity for greater community control over assets in our economy. And what more fundamental asset is there than housing and the right to shelter? It's one of, you know, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the fundamental blocks of human well-being. And of course, it's a critical component of someone's prosperity. So if we are to build a happy, healthier, and more confident and prosperous nation, then this idea has to be at the forefront of it, I think. So I'd be interested to hear more of your thoughts on how we move forward with it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. And there's been a whole bunch of stuff coming through on the chat, which David can maybe filter while we have a bit of an initial conversation. I think, you know, a lot of what you've said will chime with the experience of people who have been trying to deliver co-housing. And really, over the last 15 years, I think people have been organising, you know, at a local and a national level to try and deliver co-housing projects. Essentially, you would have to say without success, in that we haven't actually managed to build any projects. And, you know, there's a number of systemic reasons for that kind of align with what you're saying. And you can go through the policies and the procedures and so on. And there's been some progress in that. We've had co-housing written in, you know, strategic 10-year government plans, and it's in some local areas strategic housing investment plans, and it can be recommended by any number of policy reviews and guidance documents. But the reality is it hasn't happened. And I think there's been an array of different approaches by different groups in different places in Scotland trying to solve the same problem, you know, in local circumstances. And the experience is broadly that every approach has essentially proved unsuccessful because there's a fundamental problem. And I think it comes to what you were talking about, agency, and that the system as it is in Scotland at the moment hasn't been set up to deliver a pluralistic approach, that we live in a country of binary housing approaches, and there's no space in between for alternatives and for a community to get the traction to deliver something, because it doesn't have any control over that decision-making process. And the financial and the access to land resources just aren't there for communities in the way that they are for the volume house builders and for the public bodies. And it's interesting, I'm kind of aggregating 15 years of experience with different groups and not wanting to project it onto any one local authority or party or so on. But we've had these discussions at national government level and at local authority level in different scenarios. And I guess the experience is that at a political level, you know, there's lots of warm words and people think, co-housing is a lovely thing, but then you don't see the political leadership necessary to make it happen, broadly speaking. And at officer level, whether it's civil servants or housing officers in local authorities, again, they'll welcome the idea, and it'll be in it'll be something they'll want to support in policy terms. But in practice, when you speak to the officers, when it comes down to it, they say, if we had the access to the land and the opportunity to build, we would build ourselves or give it to a housing association to develop housing, because we have these strict targets to meet. And co-housing is inefficient because it's slow and ponderous, whereas we can just run this conveyor belt of housing and get it as cheap and as quick as possible. And it comes to this thing. I was in a discussion forum about the role of public bodies in the delivery of climate change, where there's been an interesting discussion about the difference between statutory requirements and guidance. And in a way, I think these community approaches to housing delivery fall under the guidance requirement, where it'd be a nice thing to do, if there was money and resources to do it. But it's the statutory provision that makes the difference, where an authority has a requirement to do it. And that means they have to have a policy to deliver it and allocate resources against it. And so I think we're at that stage where there's not a requirement, even though co-housing can be recognised, and other forms of cooperative housing can be recognised as something that's a great idea. It's not actually going to happen because there's not a requirement on anybody who has the power to deliver it to actually deliver it. And so there's the thing about how policy makes it through to delivery in that sense. Because it's been in programs for government to deliver pilot projects of co-housing, and it simply hasn't happened. And that then comes to this issue of culture change, and the fact that, as you said yourself, when you mention co-housing, it's like you've got two heads, because it's completely alien to people in a way that in other countries it's completely normal. 10% of European housing is cooperative and co-housing, and people produce housing at a much more regional or local scale. You don't have these big housing providers, and the culture around housing is completely different. So in a way, you can have the legal and statutory processes in place, but without that culture change around housing, where people understand what you're trying to do and want to support it, then will we ever actually achieve that change? The Danish model of co-housing, where the government had a very serious policy about developing co-housing to address the aging demographic, and now the majority of housing for older people is produced by co-housing. But that was done with serious core funding up front to start a new system, and a legal requirement on local authorities to make land available at below market rate for local co-housing projects. So you can make culture change, or you can encourage culture change within the system, but it kind of has to be led from the top and from the centre. In a situation like Scotland, where you've got a very centralised system without the grassroots agency. I just wonder, I know this is very long, rambling, I will come to a question, but I just wonder if there was a kind of a tipping point with COVID, where it was obvious to everybody that housing was more than an investment of capital and more than just an economic activity to get the GDP figures up, but that actually it's about people's lives and it's homes. Homes are more important than housing, and that affects everybody's physical and mental well-being, and that 20-minute neighborhoods, all these issues, just inclusion of physical and cognitive diversity in our built environment. Never mind townscape regeneration and so on. That's actually the human side of homes that's more important than the financial side of housing. And that's expressed through movements like co-housing, where people are saying, we value housing as a social investment more than we value it as a... And that challenges the current paradigm of what housing is. Housing is seen as a financial investment, not social investment. Do you think that we're seeing the start of a culture change in Scotland? Because Scotland's a very specific culture about housing. I know it's not one that you share yourself, but it's a very hard for people to conceive of other models. Do you think the landscape's moving, or do you think it's moving backwards?
There's quite an interesting Institute for Fiscal Studies report out last week about housing in Britain generally, but some of the stats were quite eye-watering. So in 1968, housing costs made up 9% of average incomes for the poorest households and 4% for the richest. And by 2021, this had gone up to 21% of average incomes for the poorest and 6% of incomes for the richest. So if you can think of the most negative redistribution of wealth possible, it has been in the radical shift in the housing market since 1979, and it being used as a commodity for capital and speculative investment. I think someone once commented, Riley, that if you want to understand British society, watch Homes Under the Hammer. It's this fetishization of property speculation. It's now become de rigueur in British society as a fashionable thing. Yet it's deeply destructive rent-seeking behaviour, and it isn't creating a new product or service or inventing a new socially useful product or whatever. It's not what built this country's wealth, which was inventive genius. It's basically a return to feudalism, and I think that is deeply dangerous. When housing costs take up 3.5 times as much household budgets of the poor as of the rich, then we need to understand this is a social crisis of inequality. Scotland culturally actually is atypical in that regard. Up until quite recently, most Scots lived in council housing. We were actually probably the most socialised society outside of the Soviet bloc. In that sense, that most people lived in municipal housing, particularly in the central belt of Scotland. And only a minority lived in private housing. So there is a culture which isn't that distant of people living in council housing and having that association with municipalism and collectivism. So I think there is an appetite to reintroduce it. If we're not going to, where else best to introduce it in Britain and in Scotland, where that culture still exists to a higher degree, where there are housing cooperatives, where there is probably a deeper penetration of social housing than anywhere else. I think the issue is the wiring of the system needs to be changed, and that's achievable. It's just that the current signals aren't there. And like you say, it's easier for housing officers and people who don't really have an overarching leadership role to just perform the role they have within the system, not to change the system. That requires leadership at a high level. And I think you're right to press the government to say you've not done enough to change the signals within the system. That it's much easier just to dispose of property to housing associations or to private developers. And it's too much hassle to look at the atypical methods of developing co-housing, but you have to start somewhere, right? And we have cooperatives, as been mentioned in the chat. I think someone mentioned that an Edinburgh example, as well as the two I mentioned in the Glasgow area. Let's build out from those, let's actually use those. I mean, it's the same in anything. Like we talk about, I think cooperative ownership, the concept of it generally has been on the wane in Scotland. So, I talk about the idea in general of creating cooperatives. Again, you're kind of looked at rather, bemusedly. People think, oh, the co-op, the supermarket, they talk about social enterprises, community interest companies. They don't talk about cooperatives in the true sense. I think we need to reintroduce this concept to Scottish society, and I think the public petition might well be a useful way of putting an anchor point down in the Parliament, that you're launching a campaign, and you're asking government to respond to that petition. They are obliged to respond to it, and you can certainly invite members of Parliament to attend the committee and to make statements in support of co-housing, and to invite housing officers and chief executives from councils in Scotland to attend the committee or make written submissions outlining why they find it difficult to promote or and support the development of co-housing initiatives And that petition acts as an anchor point for you to tease out the policy blockages. And that might be a basis for which to really iron out the critical issues that are impeding the development of co-housing in Scotland. That might well be the way forward. And it would be a useful time to do it as well because of an impending refresh of the Housing Act next year, I believe. The government has indicated that that would maybe help to drive the government in the direction of accounting for or making provision for co-housing development within the new Housing Act. If there isn't sufficient signals or coverage for the creation of co-housing, then maybe that ought to be something that's developed.
Yeah.
You're right around. I mean, I know there's some questions about acquiring land ownership and acquiring assets to develop it. I mean, one of the issues we've also got is the challenge of retrofit. And I think that's just literally popped into the chat there. Kay has said this: the Scottish Law Commission are looking at developing a new Tenements Act that will create compulsory common sinking funds to promote the common maintenance of tenements. So you might well see a retrospective development of co-housing with regards to Scotland's tenemental stock. I mean, in Glasgow alone, we have 76,000 tenements, of which around a quarter are in social housing ownership by registered social landlords, and the balance is held in private ownership. So, there could be an opportunity there to look at what the Scottish Law Commission are doing, and maybe to speak to the commissioner who's leading that project and discuss the concept of co-housing, the models elsewhere in the world, how that legislation could potentially be a useful exercise for how the tenement should be a co-ownership model. It shouldn't really be it's a bit like I suppose, in a sense, living in a tenement is a bit like the prisoner's dilemma, that, it relies on cooperation, but where's the overarching incentive to cooperate? I see it all the time with people saying, we need to get the roof fixed, but, if I live on the ground floor, I don't care about the roof, but you should care about the roof. And how do you create that sense of compulsion to cooperate? Maybe a co-housing model retrospective applied to tenements could be an interesting evolution.
Yeah, I think the just transition, in its broadest sense, is really interesting as a potential vehicle because it has a very time-specific requirement for change that cuts across the whole of Scotland, both in terms of physical changes to the built environment and to the culture around that. And it's interesting you raised retrofit there. I've been at 3 retrofit conferences in the last month. There was the CEDA one that you spoke at, which was essentially to a technical audience. There was the international conference at Best, which was really speaking to an industry audience and comparing what was going on in Ireland and other countries. And then there was the Retrofit Reimagined event in Glasgow last weekend, which was more an activist street level community thing. And in all of those spheres, there's a recognition that there's a big change coming, and a big demand. It's like, what is it, 250 homes a week need to be retrofitted for the next 20 years, and the scale of that, the scale of that activity and investment is huge. But it's also, there's a culture change that comes with that, and there's a process of delivery that at the moment is top down, and the government's due to launch its just transition for buildings in the built environment in the next few months. But that has to be delivered on an individual property and a street level, and things like community heating system and so on are in the mix that will reduce potentially the individually property rights and encourage a more cooperative approach. So, do you think that something like the climate crisis requires us to have more communal approaches to solve social and health issues, and so there's a direction of travel there towards more group processes rather than focusing on individual benefit?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting proposition. And how do you create the incentives for people to engage in that sort of cooperation? It could well be that it's patient access to capital, but conditional on, that kind of cooperation. You have to enter into these covenants to cooperate on that basis. to access the capital. That could be one of the conditions applied. If the country, if it's a bit like the student loan book, if you like, that to access this kind of patient capital needed to retrofit a tenement, in order to qualify for that, you would have to form a co-housing structure with your fellow tenement dweller. Maybe that is a way forward. It's about developing the product of the institutional capacity to make it flourish. And it's always much better to have that kind of carrot approach rather than a stick approach, right? So maybe if there were some sort of positive investment model, which the state would benefit from as well by being a supplier of capital to the co-housing development structure, but it would then incentivize people to organize themselves in that way. That then it very suddenly it becomes not the normal method of achieving the investment to renovate a tenement to be compliant with. I don't know if it could go as far as passive house standards, but certainly as close to it as possible without massive structural interventions needed. I know we saw the Niddry Road template, but how scalable that is, I don't know. But certainly there's substantial interventions that can be made in Scotland's Victorian and Edwardian or pre-1945 building stock. We've got the highest share of pre-1945 housing stock in Europe, so we have a significant challenge in how we deal with that. And obviously a lot of these buildings are of heritage value, so people don't want to just dispose of them. They want to try and retain them. And there's obviously the embodied carbon of the buildings and so on.
Yeah.
That has to be factored into it. I think an important point was made earlier in the chat about VAT being a major disincentive or perverse incentive to demolish property and to inhibit the conversion of buildings that are otherwise derelict. In Glasgow, I've got the challenge of 450 or so commercial buildings in the city centre, equivalent to the floor space of the Empire State Building, lying empty at present. And when we have a context of thousands of people homeless and excessive property prices and a real challenge around the social fabric of the city being too deep, we have the lowest population of any British city centre in Glasgow. How do we fix some of those bigger social challenges? It makes it more complex to deliver public services when people are too thinly spread. So the denser the population within our cities in particular, the more efficient and sustainable it becomes to deliver a hospital or a school or even a cleansing service. So I think we have to factor in a lot of these issues as well about improving the efficiency of our cities where the vast majority of Scots live. There's obviously a rural dimension to it as well, which is, I've got some colleagues in from more rural parts of Scotland, but I think this, the model's equally applicable there,
Let's open up the conversation. David, should we just ask people to raise their hands, or do you want to pull ones from the chat? How should we do this?
Well, I've seen 2 or 3 questions come forward, so I invite Ellie Burrows, first of all, just to kind of frame what's on your mind and chip that into the conversation just now, Ellie.
Okay, thanks, David. Yeah, I had quite a few questions that I popped in the chat, so apologies. I think you've answered quite a few of them. I think the one I'm kind of most interested, because I'm of that generation, is kind of young people being displaced and being detached from community and place just by the housing phenomenon that we're seeing. And then community groups and co-housing projects are only really supported when people are all living in the same place. But there's this fragmentation of young people who probably do want to live in places like that. And have there been any conversations around that? Really, yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, you've answered. Sorry if I'm saying you kind of answered the question. I think it is a major social dimension, and I think it was Nori that mentioned in the chat that the Scottish Government's metrics are purely about numbers of units generated. It's not about the idea of community, the qualitative aspects of housing, the fact that we still see a negative or regressive transfer of wealth from younger generation to the older property owning generation, that we see an increasing geographic issue with housing displacement, migration, forced migration due to the economic constraints of access to housing, we've seen rural depopulation. We've seen inner city depopulation. There was an interesting documentary a couple of years ago called Manktopia. It was all about the regeneration of Manchester. And one of the dynamics that it uncovered was, younger people who were private renters. Every time their lease came up for renewal, they were having to move 2 miles down the road out of town, because the rent yields were being ratcheted up at every go. And we're seeing the same in London, vast outward migrations from London. Not really seeing the same dynamic in Scotland to the same degree, but I think there are certainly the harbingers of it in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And I think that is of deep concern. We're obviously seeing the pressure for rent controls, within the Scottish government. So I think there is a major issue with people, struggling to make ends meet. Salaries certainly haven't kept pace with housing costs, and I've mentioned those stats earlier on. It's taking up an ever bigger share of people's, income, to the point where there's very little left for enjoying life. And also, young people are facing very difficult decisions when it comes to, starting a family, the security necessary for having children, etc. And that has a wider social implication. We've got an aging population. We need to encourage people to start families and have the security and the fundamentals in place to do that. Childcare costs and housing costs are prohibitive for a lot of people taking the decision to start a family. These are all bigger questions that we aren't really thinking about when it comes to the housing policy of this country. We're just chasing numbers, and ultimately we're indulging rent-seeking behaviour and exploitative behaviour as a result of that.
Thank you.
Now I wonder if Mike Wilson, you could carry on the conversation forever, I'm sure, but is there a particular focus that you'd like to pitch in a question on for Paul?
Yeah, thanks, David, and good to see you again, Paul, after last year's Glasgow Roadshow event. I couldn't agree more with what both you and Tom have been saying, but I am slightly minded of an article or a document that was put out by Gordon Brown's think tank the other day, our Scottish Future. And basically, what was pointed out in the document is that we live in a world of endless policy announcements, but they're very, very rarely backed up with delivery. And indeed, you could say that about the National Planning Framework, 4th edition. So I think ultimately it all comes down to politics. Now, my second of two questions was to what extent you harbour ambitions to become Scottish Housing Minister, and what would you do in your first 100 days? And I've made a couple of suggestions. One is a revolving loan fund to actually provide a genuine, realistic, tangible tool for communities to get their act together. But actually that we have some sort of shift from the concept of community consultation, which I think is almost a pejorative term these days. It's certainly quite toxic for those who have taken part in consultations only to be disappointed by what happens afterwards. And we move from a situation of community consultation, which at best is lip service and is at worst taking people to the top of the hill and then abandoning them, and replace it with the concept of community collaboration. Now, both you and Tom have talked about agency, and this revolving loan fund could be an ingredient of that. But communities just don't have agency to actually be involved in any of the design of their own housing. And just as a last point, I think we should be careful not to conflate social housing with co-housing, because I actually do think in reality social housing has never been in the past and is very rarely now got anything to do with community involvement. But so my final observation is that it comes down to politics. Now, we're some way off the next Scottish parliamentary elections. So what do we do between now and then to get politicians to wake up? We all seem to know what's wrong. We all seem to know what the challenges are. There's Edinburgh recently announcing a housing emergency. And lots of us know the answers, but how do we bring all of these challenges and what we know is wrong, and how do we actually fundamentally get our heads around it and do something about it? Does that help, David? Is that short enough for you?
I think you introduced a lot of interesting points. One of the big challenges in Scotland, you often go into the Parliament and say, I want to do this, why don't you invest in this or make this thing happen? And the government will respond by saying, where's the budget for that? You know, but they look at it as an exercise in accountancy rather than economics. So let's take the housing budget, for example, and say, well, we're programmed to build 7,000 social houses in Glasgow between now and 2030. I think it should be 10 times that number in terms of housing capacity. The government will say, well, we don't have the resources to finance that. But they're missing the point that, you know, banks don't have the issue because, you know, they've got returns from that investment that they then recycle and scale. So why don't we create a sort of municipal housing bank or national housing bank that can unleash the capital, you know, borrow against the national property asset book to unleash that potential. You know, I don't know, borrow against all the government buildings, all the hospitals and schools, you know, whatever it is to invest in housing where you know you're going to get a decent return, not an excessive and exploitative return, but certainly a stable return. That would then allow you the ability to invest. I mean, John Wheatley wrote a pamphlet about this 100 years ago. And he actually asked Stanley Baldwin when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer on the floor of the House of Commons in 1923 about the idea of municipal housing banks and got a kind of bemused answer. You know, so again, you know, we've not moved on very much in that period. And like you say, it's important to differentiate because the concept after the 1940, well, indeed after the 1924 Labour government and then 1945 was municipal, highly centralised development of housing on, you know, in a highly patriarchal way. Here's the new town, here's the peripheral housing scheme, you're going there. You know, that's it. You know, you've got an indoor toilet like it in Lumpet, you know, and I think Billy Connolly described moving from Anderston to Drumchapel as like kind of material improvement, you know, going from a crowded tenement classed as a slum into a lovely, you know, back and front door house with a indoor bathroom. But in a way, it was a cruel deceit, as he described it, because the notion of community had been lost. And there was a sense of social dislocation, and I think that's true of the difficulties with development of social housing. It was about, let's smash the slums, let's build 1 million houses. It wasn't really focused on the quality and the very delicate, you know, fabric that was built up over millennia of what communities are actually about. And I think you see that tension in the writing of the likes of Jane Jacobs in America, where she talks about how the modernist agenda in urban renewal was destructive socially and how she tried to preserve the essence of what New York was all about, for example. I think we have similar challenges here, and I think that's where the community housing association movement kind of is in that tradition. So I think you're right about differentiating within the broadly defined social housing sector, that the idea of a community housing association that's geographically discrete and is focused on the development of democratic ownership of housing within a distinct community is an important differentiator from the large, you know, municipal model, which is much less responsive or necessarily invested in the community, or indeed directly controlled by community representatives who are elected at the AGM or whatever. So I think that's an important point to make, that this offers an opportunity for the country to grow its wealth. You know, I think the government doesn't realise these opportunities present themselves. It's not about taxation necessarily. It's not about another ratchet on council tax. It's about finding non-taxable ways to develop national income and to boost the public finances. And I think, you know, the patient investment models around co-housing development could be the way forward. And I think that's why, you know, it'd be good for agents who are willing to develop and press this model to get more engaged with the community housing association movement, which has been, as I mentioned, increasingly corporatized and captured by large corporate interests, and to try and push this agenda on. I also would say before the next election, the way to sort of really get it on the agenda in Parliament is to sort of use the Public Petitions Committee route. I think I've been on that committee. I didn't know much about it before I joined, but I'm now a bit of an evangelist for it. And it is actually quite a useful way of bringing these issues onto the agenda in Parliament. And bringing them to the fore. I'd also consider writing to the convener of the housing committee to request that co-housing is given a consideration in their work programme. That might be a useful exercise. Ariana Burgess, the Green MSP for Highlands and Islands, is the convener of the housing committee. I would suggest writing to her as well. And indeed, perhaps also joining the tenement maintenance working group that's been established. Its secretariat for it is the Built Environment Forum Scotland, and the main sort of MSP that sort of is the link for it is Graham Simpson, the Conservative member for Central Scotland. So it might well be worth suggesting that you can attend future meetings of the Tenement Maintenance Working Group, which is looking to support the work of the Scottish Law Commission and development of that tenement reform agenda, with a view of dealing with the huge tenement maintenance backlogs we've got going on. I hope that helps answer your question.
Maybe I can briefly interject there to say that we have had, we have appeared before some of the cross-party groups on housing and architecture, and also been on some short life government working groups. But these I know these committees change, and it's an ongoing.
Cross-party groups can be a bit of a talking shop, because they're not official. They're not officially recognised parliamentary meetings as such. It depends on the leadership of them, really, but more often than not, it's more like a, come along to listen to interest. There's not necessarily actions that come out of them.
You've mentioned the Law Commission twice, and we've never looked at the legal route in terms of housing rights, but there is a thing about new legal models around mutual home ownership for co-housing, which it does require a new model to be developed, and we've tried to develop a template that might be replicable. But do you think they might be a route to gaining support for developing new legal models?
Yeah, certainly. Their job is to basically write legislation. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because I've asked them again. Sorry, this light keeps it's on a timer, so I keep having to shuffle around to trigger it. What was I going to say? Like, for example, I'm not quite sure, how we'll write legislation for tenement maintenance. Could Glasgow look at doing a pilot, given that you've got a rich tapestry of our registered social landlords? You've got a city construction company. Could you form a sort of pilot that then we could look at how it behaves, and then once it's proven to be successful, could we write legislation to basically institutionalize it? That's like one way of doing it. It's been quite, writing legislation of this kind is quite challenging, because you're trying to predict behaviour, and without a sort of template of how it might operate well in Scotland, that can be quite challenging. So I think that's maybe where a pilot ahead of legislation could be quite useful, and maybe it would be building out of an existing housing cooperative, for example, where there is available land to look at a co-op or a co-housing model. I'm open-minded about that, but you're right, it may be seen as too niche. That's the challenge, but I think it could very quickly take off. You've mentioned the sort of numbers that were being achieved in regards to sheltered housing in Denmark, for example. That could be quite significant, particularly as you're getting to a generational fulcrum point where a lot of elderly people are looking to downsize and then potentially invest in co-housing. That might be rather than paying, to private, selling off their house to pay for care, or to invest, to put it into private care. I think there is an opportunity here.
Now, I'm trying to encourage our two participants from Cohousing for Independent Living, which is a new charity which was set up a couple of years ago, to join us. But they're putting the kids to bed, so I hope that that they'll get back to us before we do this. I wonder if Andy White, you'd like to just chip in with your question, which maybe others in the room might respond to as well as our two speakers. Andy.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah, it was just a few weeks ago, we did a little bit of work on just an idea of maybe trying to help the whole co-housing equation discussion that you guys are talking about? Because obviously there's a problem. It seems we agree it's a really good idea. It could work. It works in other countries, and I know there's people working on this, and we wouldn't want to double up with them. But it seems that to get from the good idea and maybe even a group of people to actually building things is very, very difficult. So the idea was to maybe set something up. I'm quite hesitant about it, as you can see. I think I used the word perhaps twice in my question, because obviously, you know, we work as architects. That's our day job. We have the experience of getting things built. We have a little bit of experience of a fledgling co-housing project years ago that didn't happen, funnily enough. We do a little bit of development work. We know about getting hold of land, about, you know, a little bit about development finance, a lot about architecture. So it just seems, I'm not saying that we would be architects on the project, but it seems if there was someone who could sit alongside a co-housing group and maybe give them sort of development management advice, project management advice, hook them up with suitable architects. We're probably too small to get involved. So I don't know what the thoughts are on that. Is it, I know there are people doing slightly similar things, and I know there's some discussion in the group about what is co-housing. I think of co-housing as self-organized group self-build, but it could cross over with social housing a little bit if it was a kind of unit that did several projects. So quite a few ideas, but I'm interested to, it's not really a question, it's just sort of to float that and get feedback. I'm a little bit reticent about taking it further because we don't want to double up, and we don't mind doing a certain amount of unpaid work, but at a certain point it would either need to be self-funding or it would need to be, you know, fundable somehow. So I'm keen to get opinions on that. Meantime, we got very busy with normal work, so I haven't really looked at it for a few weeks, but we did have a few conversations with a few people, so just keen to garner thoughts or feedback on the idea.
If I can answer that to some extent, the big problem for most co-housing groups seems to be getting land, getting approval to get land. Now, the Community Empowerment Act should enable some groups to endeavour to get some land by working with the local authority. There are people here tonight, I think, who come from Clachan, and we know they've been through the years of it, and Bavarium had the same in Fife. And we, a part of Choice, City of Edinburgh Council has been meant to help us find a site, and for the last 2 years we've been kind of looking, and the only sites they've ever promoted have been wholly unsuitable or not really available, quite honestly. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're offering, Andy, is would be very useful, because some of the co-housing groups don't have that expertise within their ranks that you're referring to and can offer. But at the moment, it's getting land, getting a site that is the difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I agree with your analysis. That's where maybe somebody between the architect and the group is helpful, because architects don't really know a lot about finding land, and they don't know a lot about the kind of upper organization of a project. I mean, once you've got a piece of land and you've got a brief, go to an architect, they might give you an excellent job. But there's a kind of interface. You've got a group of lay people who want to build 10 houses or 20 flats, whatever it is. So to get from that kind of idea point where you've got your group to the point where you've got a piece of land, you've got a good architect on board, you've maybe got financing and so on, it seems that is the bit that everyone's falling down. Because this is a great idea. If a few groups could get to the next stage, you could start to solve some of the problems that we're talking about.
But this is where you need a national strategy. And what happened in England was the government put up 100 or 120 million pounds for community-led housing, set up hubs, made it a very simple process. You know, the criticism is it was very short-term, and it needs to be a more of a long-term strategy. But it set up a simple system that local groups could access with that upfront enabling finance and support officers in place. And that's been Co-Housing Scotland's recommendation to the Scottish Government for a number of years now, and pilot projects to develop a template process. but it hasn't happened. I think Frank had his hand up there. Do you have a question, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a member of that fledgling group from Maryhill you were mentioning earlier, Paul. We've actually been at it for 8 years. So fledgling we are not. Old and decrepit we certainly are. And I would also maybe add quite a few bruises in my head from hitting it off a brick wall. So that's our experience. 8 years in Glasgow trying to build a co-housing community. And may I say, deliberately designed around the cooperative model. We are actually a registered housing cooperative. And what we've experienced is what Mike Wilson said earlier, there's no money. And we do desperately require money. Now, because we're a cooperative, we can't go down the charity road, nor can we go down the community road either. Therefore, we're excluded from the community right to buy, for instance. And as I say, we have no funding available because we've got no access to the big amounts of money that charities have. So to develop their business. So we need money, and we need a revolving loan fund, not grants, revolving loan fund. That's what we need. And it's £3 to £5 million just to start it off. I think what Tom Morton was saying about England, we drew a lot from England. It's been particularly Leeds area. And if you like, there was a bit of me always niggling away as to why we were driving down to England to get this learning. Why was it not in Scotland?
I think the revolving loan fund, sorry to cut across you.
Actually, Paul, I'd quite like to finish what I have to say first, and then you can respond. I think the reason we were doing it down there because there was nothing in Scotland. There's precious little in Scotland except individuals with some experience, which we grabbed a hold of. So there's a real problem there. And it's a problem at a policy level, both nationally and locally. And you guys in the MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, as a member of them, I think you are, of the Cooperative Party, then there's a number of Labour and Cooperative MSPs in the Parliament. You should begin to act as members of the Cooperative Party and not just members of the Labour Party. The two are not necessarily the same thing. So we need to get something done about cooperatives in Scotland, and you guys need to get the policy in place in order the policy then leads to the funding, and if the funding begins to unlock initiatives. That's what's missing. And I mean, I'll finally finish off on this. I'm not blowing my own horn, but the 10 people involved in Clacking were very, very able people with long CVs in the community, long CVs, including one former Labour councillor in the city of Glasgow. So that's what we were, and we're looking at failure. No, we're not depressed about the failure. We're learning from the failure, and I'm sharing that learning this evening with you. Right? So you need to get this sorted out, policy in place. It then needs to lead some dosh. It doesn't need to be a massive amount of dosh, and we don't want any grants. We want loans. And then we also want to start being recognised as a cooperative equal to a community organisation. Might be different legally, but equal to a community organisation, which therefore then gives us access to all the grant funding which is around, which at the moment we can't get near. All yours, Paul.
Thanks. No, I think these are fair challenges. I've actually just been elected to the National Executive Committee of the Cooperative Party, so I'm going to Birmingham on Saturday to attend the first meeting. So I'll certainly raise this with them about a broader issue in cooperative housing. The nearest housing cooperative, I think, to Maryhill is the Hawthorn Co-op in Postle Park. And I don't know what interest they have in supporting the project in Maryhill, if any. It could be an opportunity to sort of collaborate to improve the cooperative agenda. I think your point about the revolving loan fund is a critical one. It might be the core of the petition that you present to the Scottish Parliament if that's an action you want to take forward. Doesn't seem like a particularly difficult ask to release 3 million of capital to allow a pilot to be undertaken, which you could say the Clacking project is. And then we can see how it performs. Certainly that has acquired land, if I'm correct. So there is a basis for a pilot to be undertaken there. It's part of the transformational regeneration area as identified by Glasgow City Council, I think. So, there's an opportunity there. you know, let's see how we go. I would just say that I feel like the patron saint of lost causes in opposition a lot of the time. You know, it's one thing to stand up in Parliament and make suggestions. I make plenty of those, but too often they fall on deaf ears in terms of government ministers doing anything about them. It took us 2 years to get the government to agree to a £2 million fund to extend concessionary bus travel to asylum seekers, for example, which was a Maryhill Integration Network-led campaign. But I'm just saying that the effort just to nudge the government fairly modestly in a certain direction can be very exhausting. But I take your point on board that this is a direction of travel we should be pressing. I think it's important to go along and speak to the likes of the Glasgow and West Scotland Housing Association Forum to see if you can build alliances there. David Bookbinder is a particularly helpful character there. You know, it'd be worth speaking to him about how to move things on and whether there's a potential for alliances there. You know, obviously the local housing association is Maryhill Housing Association. I'm not sure whether they've been particularly supportive or not, or Queen's Cross Housing Association, but I think you know, these are the sorts of collaborations that might crack the difficulty of accessing capital. But I think once you get a sizable pilot underway and can demonstrate the performance of it, then very suddenly people might wake up to the sort of sleeping giant that is this movement. That's my take on it. You know, I've a lot more grey hair, believe it or not, than when I started, you know, a parliamentarian, and it can be pretty exhausting being in opposition because you've got your ideas rich but powerless to affect them often. You can certainly advocate for ideas, but it's challenging. I do think the Scottish Parliament's more, you're more capable of leveraging something to move forward in the Scottish Parliament just by with the arithmetic in the Parliament, but it can still be difficult. And I think there's too much of a culture of laissez-faire economics at the heart of government decision making, which we really need to overcome.
Oh, when just before we started, I was promising Paul that we'd probably finish between 8:30 and 9, but 9 o'clock's racing towards us. So, Andy, you just had a little supplementary you wanted to chip in. And then I wonder if anybody from Chill, Co-housing, Independent Living might come in after that. Andy.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add in to what Frank was saying in Paul's response. We had 3 or 4 different meetings with different people about how you might set up a co-housing support group, facilitation unit, whatever you want to call it. And a bit what they're talking about came up that if it's co-housing and it's owned, it shouldn't get public money put into the build cost, land cost. That seems to be a bit of a bugbear, if you like. That's not my opinion, but that's the kind of opinion that's out there. But I agree that some kind of start off funding to get a group going, to do an example group, that seems rational. I mean, there's all sorts of help to buy schemes and where big amounts of money are actually given to huge corporate developers. So why not give modest money to a co-housing group? But it seems when we were analysing this a couple of months ago, it seems you get pushed away from co-housing and you know, collaborative self-build where people own the houses or own the flats back towards social housing. Because if it's social housing, then it's much more fundable. Do you see what I mean? It can get government funding. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that's what happens when you analyse this at a higher level. So I don't disagree with what's been said. I think that's maybe the problem that Frank has come up against. If it's owned, then it's very difficult to get grants. You know, but if you think about it, co-housing, you're delivering housing that is individual, hopefully well designed for less than developers would charge. So, and it's putting more units into circulation, which is helping the overall problem. Because I'm sure you all know that big house builders deliberately don't build enough houses. So this fuels the price rises and the rent rises and so on and so on. So if people can build their own houses in an efficient, collaborative way, it really helps to solve the problem. So I think it should get some seed funding from government. I feel bad for Paul because he's not a minister. He's not in the Scottish government, so it's probably difficult for you to as you said, you can't just solve these problems. You're a bystander, I think you said, to watching this.
Well, a frustrated advocate, you know.
Yeah, we should have someone here from the Scottish Government, because I mean, they are making a lot of very well-intentioned mistakes, quite big mistakes, some of them. So it'd be good to actually question them where they think this is all heading.
I come back to the idea of the petition because it allows for the petitions committee to have an inquiry. So I mean, an example of a recent petition was protections for ancient woodlands in Scotland. And it's led to a broad inquiry into extra protections for, you know, Scottish temperate rainforests and natural woodland and so on, and looking at regulating the Forestry Commission and how they use conifers and stuff. I know it's a bit of a left field point, but it also relates to, you know, this tendency towards greenwashing with carbon offsetting by forestry plantations and stuff like that, you know, and the ownership of so-called green lairds and all of this. So I think there's that's a interesting inquiry that's been developing, and in several occasions the minister has had to come to the committee and be scrutinised by the members of the committee with witnesses from the stakeholder groups present, etc. You know, I think it is a useful exercise to sort of look at this and to how you can further develop it, and it certainly helps to put this on the radar of civil servants, of ministers, and to this sort of, you know, it does help to ratchet things up a bit.
Okay, because we've got short time, I'm going to unpin Andy and Frank. Thanks so much for your contributions. Great. Can we see if Hilary or her friend from Chill are able to share their ideas?
Hi, I don't know what we've really got to help people.
Say hello.
Hi, I'm Hilary. I'm actually, I think people were mentioning Co here, which is Pete, who's my brother, and John. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the history of Chill, really. Lisa and I have both got young lads with Down syndrome, and we've known each other for years. I live in Orkney now, but I used to live in Edinburgh, and soon to be back in Edinburgh. And we were just talking about, Lisa, I'm not sure if Lisa's around or not, but we were having a conversation over Zoom one time about housing for our kids, and I was telling her about what my brother was doing with John, and Lisa said, "Oh, that sounds like an amazing thing for our lads, doesn't it?" You know, so I spoke to Pete, and he and John got together, and they really supported us a lot at the beginning. We've been together for nearly 2 years. I think we formed a charity. It was all very sort of exciting at the beginning. Pete helped us get our a sort of business plan together, and just all the sort of background paperwork and stuff. We're just parents, you know, we've no business experience at all. So it was great having Pete there to help us. But our problem ran into funding. You know, we don't have any funds at all, or we didn't until recently. And we've got some really good trustees on the board now. So we applied for Awards for All, and we've got a grant just for a coordinator post to do a few hours a week, really, to help us engage with the Down syndrome community, about just to prove that there is a need. We all know that a lot of people with Down syndrome end up living with their families, being very isolated. We want people to be in control of their housing and have choice about where they live, and to mix with just their regular community. So it's not all people with disabilities, but so none of us really knew much about co-housing, but it just sounds perfect, really, for our lads. So that's kind of where we are.
It's just really heartening. I've seen, in looking on the charity register, Chill coming up. So it's really nice to meet you, Hilary. I think probably your friends are stuck with the Chill, putting others to bed. it's a bit like co-housing for seniors, which is another particular segment of the population for whom it would be incredibly valuable.
We know, I know Kath from Orkney as well, because she's part of Hope Co-housing.
Yes.
So yeah, we've been sort of having a little chat sometimes. We don't see each other that much.
Great. Well, we look forward to welcoming you when you return to Edinburgh. Any last points? Because we're rapidly coming up to 9 o'clock, and then I'd hopefully invite Paul to just say any reflections. You've given us a few pointers, ideas of petitions committee, some names that you've shared with us. Thank you so much. And but anybody else want to chip in with a point? Thank you, Hilary. Anybody else? Then Tom.
Margaret, I think Margaret's got her hand up.
All right. There you go, Margaret.
To thank you, Paul, for a very interesting evening. It's been fascinating. I understand that you were educated in Eastern Bartonshire, where in Lenzie, where I live, and we are trying to get senior co-housing off the ground there. And you'll know, of course, that like yourself, Tom Johnson was educated in Eastern Bartonshire, in Lenzie, in fact, and he introduced municipal banking that you referred to into Scotland. Now, I wondered, is municipal banking still extant in Scotland?
I believe there's actually still the Eastern Bartonshire Municipal Bank. Whether how scalable it is, I'm not sure. There was a couple of other municipal banks, but they're so small, you know, that's the issue. And the question is actually understanding how they could be part of this picture. It's an interesting proposition. I'd need to ask or need to study it in more detail. I haven't fully inquired into the state of municipal banking in Scotland, but I certainly know the Eastern Bartonshire Bank is still around, though how big it is another question.
It fits so neatly with the Scotland Loves Local agenda and the growing tide, a political tide towards localism and a community wealth building.
Absolutely.
Nori, you've got your hand, and then I think we'll need to wrap up, David.
Thanks, Paul. This has been very useful, and I really appreciate what you've done.
Yeah.
One of the things I think we do need, co-housing needs as a subject matter, is ways of developing the benefits that we provide and putting money against that, whether it be dealing with isolation, mental health, self-supporting, and finding ways of housing that we build to a higher standard that is affordable. And I think the point about various councils seeing co-housing as being a private developer thing, or it's for their own benefits, is actually not really the case, because the majority of us are looking to provide affordable housing at the end of the day, with a structure that does not allow individuals to own their own place and sell it on at a profit. And so that's part of the messaging. So I think there's a number of support things that we need to pull together along with policy that supports what co-housing can provide or demonstrates the benefits clearly. So that's me finished.
I totally agree.
Tom, over back to you to just wrap up then.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we're verging into the party political train there. I've been trying to avoid, because I think this is very much, you know, it's a human issue rather than a party issue. But the world of politics is where a lot of the power resides that we need to engage with to deliver the kind of change that we need. And you know, I know we've had support from different parties or people in different parties at different levels, but you know, Paul's been the first person who's stood up as an MSP to come and have a conversation with us, and indeed we will invite others. So thanks very much, Paul, for coming along. It's been, you know, really useful, I think, both from possible practical next steps we might take, as well as seeing the context of what we're trying to do within the broader history of housing in Scotland and, you know, community agency as well. I know we've kept you late, so I won't rabbit on, but just if we can all show our appreciation to Paul and we will see you all again at the next co-housing conversation. Thank you very much, Paul.
Look forward to the petition. I'll come along and speak in favour of it.
Thank you.